You're watching Arth, a culture fest promoted by Z. And you just heard and witnessed a very candid conversation with Shri Nitin Gadkari ji. Indeed, there was so much to learn from it. One thing you will all agree with me is that with such transparent and candid leaders, we would always have a future vision. Ladies and gentlemen, the next topic that we will be divulging into deals with the future. So we have a panel discussion which is titled as a vision of India for the future. Let me go ahead and quickly welcome in our panelists to join on. We've got an eminent set of panelists here, starting with Ms. Amrita Narlikar, who's the president of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, professor at Hamburg University and non-resident senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Her research expertise lies in the areas of multilateralism, international negotiation, WTO, and also rising powers. Professor Narlikar has published numerous books and articles with renowned publishing houses. Her most recent book has been published by the Cambridge University Press, Poverty Narratives in International Trade Negotiations and Beyond. Joining her on the panel is going to be Mr. Harsh Gupta Madhusudan, who's an India-based public markets investor. He has written extensively on economics, finance, politics for Mint and Swarajya, the Wall Street Journal, the Indian Express and other publications as well. Next up is Mr. Rajeev Mantri, who is an India-based entrepreneur and investor, investing in public companies and early-stage technology ventures. He has contributed articles on political economy, technology, investing and entrepreneurship to Mint, Swarajya, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the Indian Express, the New York Times International Weekly and other publications as well. Now this one is going to be a bigger panel, and we also have with us Gautam Chikermane, who's the Vice President at Observer Research Foundation. His areas of research are economics, politics, foreign policy and the Mahabharata. An author of his newest book is India 2030, The Rise of Rajasic Nation. Now this session is going to be moderated by Ms. Palki Sharma, who's the executive editor at WION, India's only international news channel. She hosts a primetime news and view show called Gravitas that tracks and comments on all the big developments around the world. Another interesting session coming your way. Go watch it out.
Thank you, Kanishk, for the introduction, and good afternoon to all of those who are joining us right now. Welcome to this session. We are going to discuss a vision of India for the future. And a few days back, I promised all the panelists that I'm going to ask some tough questions, and I hope to live up to that. But before I do that, let me give the audience a quick primer. Suddenly, it seems everyone is talking about a new vision, a new India, and books are being written, and all of our panelists have written on this subject. Gautam Chikermane's new book is called India 2030, The Rise of a Rajasic Nation. Harsh and Rajiv have written a book called A New Idea of India, and Amrita's book came out last year, India Rising, a multi-layered analysis of ideas, interests, and institutions. So, and they're all fabulous books, and if you haven't read them, you should all go out and read them and pick your copy. Our External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, also wrote a book recently. It's called The India Way. The question then is, why is there so much focus suddenly on a new India and a new vision? So in this discussion, we are hoping to cover these few broad points. What do we mean when we say that we have a vision for a country? Why does India need a new vision and a new approach? What is the vision of India that we're working on, or for India that we're working on, and where will that vision take us? So this is the broad, these are the broad parameters for this discussion. Gautam, I'm going to start with you. Your book, The Rise of India, says that the rise of India in the coming decade will be driven by what you call a Rajasic force. What is a Rajasic force? What does that mean, and what does it have to do with India's rise?
So, thank you. Rajasic force is part of the three gunas, which is again part of the Sankhya philosophy, one of the Indian traditions, intellectual traditions that examines how individuals function. each of us has three aspects of these gunas, which is tamas, rajas, and sattva. Uh, Tamas, as you know, is all indolence, lethargy. Rajas is dynamism, action. Sattva is equilibrium. Each individual has some aspect or some variant, some collection of these aspects as a being. That was Rishi Kapila's philosophy. Sri Aurobindo expanded that philosophy and applied it to nations. According to him, nations also go through ups and downs between tamas and rajas. Very slightly, very small, in a very small way, they sometimes touch sattva, but essentially the cycle is between tamas and rajas. I have taken these, both of them, Rishi Kapila's work and Sri Aurobindo's work, and I'm trying to apply it to 21st century India. And what I see in every aspect of where India is now headed, be it the economy, be it foreign policy, be it law and order, be it defense, any aspect of India that you see a new dynamism. At least I see a new dynamism. Was this dynamism not there earlier? No, that's not correct. But the pace of this dynamism I see increasing. For instance, in foreign policy, I think India is now taking far stronger, firmer, more assertive steps. It has been able to, in the defense, Balakot has proved that you cannot mess around with India too much. Galwan is proving that even a much stronger power will have to step back and not get onto India's toes. On the economic front, we are close to being a 3 trillion. We have aspirations to be a 5 trillion economy. Within this decade, we are going to be the world's third largest economy. All these require a whole lot of dynamism from individuals and collectively as a nation. My sense is that over the last 2 or 3 decades, this Rajasic force has been sort of waiting to express itself. Now, the time has come. It seems everybody is looking for the India way. You mentioned Jaishankar's book. Jaishankar has also talked about the India way, which is rooted in the past, but looking into the future. In my book, there are 20 authors who have forecast what India 2030 looks like. All of them. In fact, my introduction, the book was going to be very different, to be very honest. The book was going to be very different. It is only after I read all of the chapters that I realized the underlying theme is actually a Rajasic theme. And that's the philosophical basis of where India is going to be in the next 10 years and mostly in the 21st century.
Very interesting concept. Rajeev and Harsh, your book talks about a new idea of India, and we're all basically looking at unleashing a latent potential, a latent force. You've both emphasized on how India's civilizational legacy is often ignored. Rajeev, let me start with you. How does legacy shape the vision for future?
So I think the starting point is always, to know where you want to go or to sort of define a destination. First, we have to know where we came from, and that history offers its own lessons. It offers its own kind of learnings that can be applied to know where we want to go. Obviously, the experience of India over the last 60, 70 years, almost 75 years now, actually, since independence, has, it has been, to put it probably most fairly, it's a mixed bag. The Indian state has done well in certain aspects. In other aspects, we have not done so well. And particularly in the economic aspect, if you talk about the economic aspect, there was a marked change after 1991. In the last 30 years, we've seen the change that liberalization has got. So I think legacy matters, or history matters, to sort of be able to make the right decisions to fulfill the vision, the aspiration that we are looking forward to and sort of aspiring towards.
Harsh, it is individuals who make nations. And when we say that we should tap into India's civilizational legacy and draw from it to shape our future, do you believe that there is a shift in our approach, in the way we look at India? Do you think that there is a sense of pride now more than before? And what do you attribute the shift to?
Thank you so much, Palki. I absolutely agree with you that there is a discernible shift in the way we think about India. There is more of a pride. And I think the big reason is earlier, for a few decades, it became fashionable to see India as a post-colonial entity. That, like we're just one more accident of history or colonialism, even though that was not necessarily the view of the so-called founding fathers themselves. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, that became the view. Now we are much more open and understanding and accepting that it is the world's largest, the world's most ancient continuing civilization. And soon we'll have the world's largest population amongst those large countries, civilization countries. India will overtake the population of China. India's population together is the same of North America, South America, and Western Europe put together. So this massive and ancient civilization, only continuing civilization, even China through the Maoist period had a break in terms of its cultural, religious, and civilizational values, though it's now bringing back the Confucian ethos. But India had a continuous streak, and that is for the first time getting a modern state. Now, obviously that started earlier, it started in 1947, in some cases it started even earlier, but it seems to have come all together around right now. And I fully agree with Gautam and Rajeev's kind of formulations of why this coming decade, the decade we've already entered, has a sense of anticipation. And it's kind of an overused phrase about an inflection point, but it does seem to be an inflection point, that there seems to be an ancient nation, ancient civilization, a young nation demographically, a modern state starting from a very low per capita economic base. And the only way to go is up. And India is not doing that by losing its ancient values. So in that sense, because in a dharmic context, as opposed to an Abrahamic context, the ancient and modern are not orthogonal to each other. They're very much syncretic to each other. There's not a sense of time period. There is a very clear sense of the secular and the spiritual can coexist, because there is no truth claim. There is only kind of inner search for salvation and kind of moksha, as we say it. So there's no kind of question about, oh my God, can we accept modern science? Does that mean we are foregoing our civilization? There is no false choices to that sense. So I'm very confident in that sense, because the basis of the civilization is very strong.
Right. Amrita, we've spoken a lot about India's culture and civilizational legacy. And as we reintroduce, some of us are reintroducing ourselves to what is India and what is the true essence of being an Indian. We are also at some level, I think, using our values in our engagements with the world. I think vaccine Maitri is one such example. In India, we always say Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, and we are leading by example in that respect. We are sharing with the rest of the world while our own country also deals with the pandemic. How do you think India can do more of this, can use more of its rich history and culture and values to reform and mold global institutions?
Thank you, Palki. Great question. And I also want to pick up on some of the points that Gautam started off with, and then both Rajeev and Harsh also picked up. And what Gautam said was, India is increasingly showing all the traits of a Rajasic nation, with which I entirely agree. He also pointed to the Sattvic traits. And that's what you're talking about as well, Palki, right? When you're talking about values. And sometimes those two can go together in a very powerful and important and timely combination. And so what we have seen for the past almost 70 years, over 70 years, the multilateral order has been premised on the assumption that you get economic integration and that will automatically lead to peace. Now, increasingly, it is becoming evident that that is not the case. The values that were supposed to underpin the multilateral order are being challenged by systemic rivals. Those systemic rivals include China. And what this is showing us is that there is a crying need for values to be underpinning the multilateral order. We have to be asking the question, what is the purpose of multilateralism? What is the purpose of foreign policy? And we've other important dimensions. There's economics, there's security, and there's values. And we need to have all three of these together. And this is where India can play such an important role. One, by one of the ideas that you mentioned, that's been also quoted by others like President Obama. And that shlok, of course, is Udara Charitanam tu Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. right? For the minded, the whole entire world is a family. But India is very shy of claiming this. India's tried to show itself to be quite transactional, right? It's been criticized in the past. So it's tried to make itself, we're realist, we're transactional, and we need that. But we also need to be taking ownership of our values. And those values are democracy and pluralism and liberalism as we understand it as Indians, right? So this is a great opportunity also for the West to be looking at India, to be engaging with India, and for India to be asserting both itself economically in terms of security, as the previous speakers have said, and also in terms of values.
I want to ask you one more question, Amrita. You said that India and a lot of Indians, I agree with you, are shy of taking credit for what they have achieved and are shy of wearing their values and their legacy on their sleeve, as it were. What is it that is preventing Indians from accepting and taking pride in what they have and what has been passed on to them for generations? And how can they build on it? What is it that is holding us back?
I think it's three things that's been holding us back. One is something that Harsh already touched upon, right? And he said, now we're increasingly looking at ourselves with greater pride. This is a coming of age. It's what Gautam is talking about when he's talking about the emergence of a Rajasic nation, right? So one, it's about it's about it's the domestic. It's the domestic angle. But there are two other very important angles that have held India back from claiming its values. And that's one, sort of the West has always looked upon India as somehow that benighted nation, right? This is really a problem, right? And this is not us in India being post-colonial. This is the West still stuck in a very post-colonial mindset, right? And so even now when you hear sort of Europe and the US talking about increasing engagement with India, what they're saying is don't talk about values. They don't know how to do democracy. They don't know democracy, but we need them because there's China there. So it's all about interests, right? So one, it's about Western perceptions. And two, somehow sort of academics in particular, but also practitioners have always argued, most of them have argued there's a separation between ideas and values. So if you talk, values and interests. So if you talk about values, you're somehow being idealistic. That's not true. The two go hand in hand, right? So if you talk about values, doesn't mean you don't stand up for your interests. Your values make your interests, and the interests then reinforce values. They're reflexive, right? So it's those two things that have really stopped India from claiming what it can. And India also is growing, right? I mean, also in terms of it's the full force of its ideational power, right? So now is the time when there is a need for values that India should be exploiting. And when it's engaging with the US and the EU and they're telling us, don't talk about values, what we need to be saying is, you guys, you talk about labor standards and environmental standards when you talk about values. Yeah, those are important. But we actually think there are many other macro level values. Once you achieve those, you will also achieve labor and environmental standards. And those are democracy, liberalism, and so forth.
Indeed, very interesting. Gautam, the West is not going to change their approach towards India just because we want them to. And they're engaging with us, A, because India is the other giant in Asia, B, also because India is a huge market and they want to have access to that market. So if we turn this around and we say, okay, we want to focus on values, but for the world to take us as seriously, for want of a better word, it is important for us to have a robust economy to realize our vision for India's future. In August last year, while writing about India's GDP contraction, you had said that the pandemic and the lockdown have left behind an economic devastation. It's been a year since then. What are your thoughts on the Indian economy, and what do you think needs to be done on this front to realize India's potential?
Very interesting question, a tough question as you had promised. I want to take one step back before I get on to this question, which is what Amrita said, how the West looks at India. And it sees it as a coalescing of interests and, as you mentioned, markets. But I think the biggest hurdle to the rise of India is not the vision of the West or the aggression of China. It is India itself. We talk about values. What values are we talking about here? Are we talking about freedom? Are we talking about economic freedom? Well, let me throw some numbers at you. There are 1,500 laws that govern doing business in this country. There are 6,000 filings that businesses need to do at an aggregate. There are 69,000 compliances that businesses have to follow and report every year at an aggregate. I'm not saying every business has to do that for everything. I think we have, and all this is why? Because we have created an Inspector Raj, rent-seeking infrastructure for the economy that prevents entrepreneurs from flowering. Until 1991, we shunned large businesses physically with statements. On my next book, you're going to read about that. Even today, there is some form of, there is actually, and this is where the Rajasic part, which I talk about, comes in. Even today, there is a wrestling match going on between the past, who says crony capitalism, big business is bad, and look how many billionaires are there in India, and what a shame that there are so many poor. And on the other side, we have Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who, as a serving Prime Minister, for the first time that I have heard, has said that we want wealth creators. Manmohan Singh did say it in his 1991 epic speech, but then he was the finance minister, not the Prime Minister. And I think these kind of changes are now going. So India has been held back by India. India is now going to be unleashed by Indians. And the only difference is this movement from tamas to rajas. As far as how the world goes, India is a big market. Of course it is. Not only is it a big market, it is the most open market. 40% of our GDP comes from trade. Which country, which Western nation can talk about that? A handful. Amrita mentioned labor. Amrita mentioned clean air. Per capita, India is one of the lowest polluters in the world. In labor laws, I think we've gone to such excesses that it would put Sweden to shame. I think we are doing very fine. There is a change of narrative. There is a shift in narrative that is now required to tell the story of who we are. All the time, our stories are being told by some other outside lens. Those lenses, let us talk about academics, lean on the previous academics. Let me give you one small example and I'll conclude here. There was a policy, an industrial policy that was drafted in, the first industrial policy was drafted in 1948. The whole world, Indian academics, foreign academics, everybody calls that policy Industrial Policy Resolution 1948. There is no such document in the Indian literature. There is no such document. There is no such document that says Industrial Policy Resolution 1948. It is just called resolution. But you look at JSTOR, you look at any book, you look at the best scholars in this world and in India, they will be talking about this. Why? Because some scholar, I think it was in Cambridge or was it Oxford, began with this saying that the new industrial policy 1948, and everybody just copy pasting it without looking at the primary data. Now I see a lot of Indians looking at primary data, re-examining that data, not necessarily to counter narrative, but just to explore the narratives. For instance, what Harsh and Rajeev have done in their work. And I think new insights, new information is coming, which has always been lying there buried under the weight of how the West looks at us. I think India needs to start looking at itself and start fixing itself from within. And that's what's happening now.
I can very happily say that we've made that start with WION, where we are telling India's stories and India's voices, and we're also talking about India's narrative vis-a-vis the world. But you talked about India and Indians holding us back. And yes, there is a need for reform. So Harsh, if I could come to you with this question. Yes, we need reforms. Yes, we need to make that leap. But every time there's an attempt at reform, there's also pushback, not just from within, but interestingly, leaders outside. I mean, I still can't wrap this around my head that the British Parliament every couple of weeks finds it their business to discuss laws in India, Indian laws, while there is so much that is going on in Britain, that the Canadian Prime Minister thinks it's his business to advise us on the farmer protest, that a senator in the US thinks that when the defense secretary is visiting India, he should give him advice on what should be raised in his conversations with Indian leaders. So that is one aspect. The second is what is happening within. And in a democracy, yes, there will be protests. So how do you balance the two? How do you make sure that we go ahead with the reform that is needed to achieve our vision, while at the same time taking as many elements in the society with us as possible?
So I think, Palki, that's an excellent question. And I think there is something much more important at the root of it. The root of it is that the Western worldview, in its own mindset, is universalistic. It's basically it's a secular descendant of the Abrahamic theologies. So there is a very deep-rooted understanding in their mind of, like, again, a secular version of evangelism, that if this is a human right, it is fair for everybody to speak about it. Of course, there might be all kinds of hypocrisies around it and so on and so forth. And I think India has initially missed a trick by being, I would say, being too touchy about it. And I think of late we have done the right response by in turn talking about, for example, racism in the UK. I don't think there's any way to prevent other people from talking about us. And I think if we go down that road, we'll just come across very quickly. I think the right thing is for us to talk about others as well, not just in a necessarily tit for tat manner, but also, this is where it gets really deep, is we have to have our own universalism. And the Indian universalism is different because it is the only non-homogenizing universalism in the world. I mean, that's again rooted in our dharma. It's the only non-homogenizing universalism in the world. And that in turn is very important. Again, coming back to economics, is because for around 1,000 years we were colonized, first by the Turks, then by the British. We kind of lost touch with our traditions of statecraft. So if you read a lot of these traditions, the 6 Astika traditions that Gautam also referred to, a lot of them are very beautiful philosophies, but they're basically about the self and the Brahman, right? The universe and self. But what is missing is a lot of introspection on my relation with my fellow man. And part of that is, and part of the reason why we allied that is because of a certain agricultural, economic, feudal kind of understanding of Varna and caste, which we have now overturned. And therefore, we basically pretend we don't have any statecraft legacy. We kind of then copy paste the West and then try to force fit into our frameworks. So I think part of the reason these are just learning pains, we're actually getting back to know and create and modify our own statecraft in tune with the philosophy that is brilliant about our individual salvation. How do you take that and how does that lead to statecraft and answer questions like what Amrita asked, what is realism versus constructivism in international relations and trade? Why do values and interests have to be orthogonal? Maybe they're in Myanmar, maybe they're not in some other case. So I think to answer your question broadly, we should not be prickly about it. We should in turn talk about others really. For example, the killings of 8 Asian Americans in the US right now. It's not just tit for tat, it's a terrible case of racism. And apparently the local police officer said he just had a bad day. The killer had a bad day. So, why should we not talk about it? And because the point is, if we do not talk about it, we are pretending the other country is perfect. And then we get really angry when the other country says we are not perfect, because no country is perfect. We can only go towards a more perfect union, as Barack Obama likes to say. So I think we should not be so prickly, and we should talk about others as well and have our own universalism. Correct.
Rajeev, to be able to talk about and weigh in on the issues of others, that also stems from confidence. That also stems from the sense that I should have a say on what's happening, because I am a stakeholder in the global order, in the global affairs, and there is a reason why such and such country or society or whatever entity should listen to what I'm saying, because my point of view is important. I think that's how the West approaches the rest of the world. And do you see India also slowly graduating towards that, while we remain mindful of the fact that we do not want to interfere and be bullying or be talking down to any country. We do raise issues. A very interesting example comes to my mind when Prime Minister Modi went to the United Nations General Assembly. I think he was the only world leader who spoke about the issues that really matter to the world. He spoke about sustainable development goals. He talked about things that the world should be focusing on rather than one country taking aim at another. So do you see, Rajeev, this shift in India's approach to the rest of the world?
On this aspect of others talking about us and us talking about others, there's one of my favorite Oscar Wilde quotes. Oscar Wilde had said, "The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about." So in a sense, the fact that countries are now, focusing heavily on India in this manner, micro-analyzing regional protests, talking about, legislative changes that we are bringing in our economy in this detail, only shows that India is an increasingly important country on the world stage. So we should be prepared for more scrutiny on that front. But as Harsh said, just the way other countries are talking about us, we can do the same about them. We can, return the compliment, so to say. I think a gap somewhere there was that, India didn't really have media organizations. India did not really have sort of an intellectual class that could do that earlier, or at least a sort of independent intellectual class that could do that earlier, which is now coming up. I think there are certain sort of media, TV channels, newspapers, magazines, even think tanks that are now sort of taking an India-centric view and putting it before the world. In fact, they are inviting global decision makers to look at issues from the perspective of India and Asia and South Asia. So I think I just see it as a teething problem where, as India sort of comes out of this cocoon that we had put ourselves into for the first 5 odd decades, as we come out of that, we will be engaging more and more with the world.
Right. Gautam, India's approach to world affairs has also graduated from non-alignment to what we now call strategic autonomy. And as we speak, we know that his maiden visit, the US Defense Secretary has India as one of his destinations, and that only underscores the significance of India in the changing global order. The question then is, how do we balance autonomy with alliances to fulfill what you've called our Swadharma as a nation?
I'll just answer this question, but in that previous discussion about the India story, I think we have 2 examples sitting on this podium itself. I mean, one is Beyond, which is where you personally, Palki, have done a great job in tracking China. The other is ORF, where we are constantly commenting on in deep manner on what the global affairs are. So I think that step has been taken. I just hope it multiplies.
Yeah, I didn't take the names, Gautam, but I had those names in mind too.
Okay, thank you. Now, as far as strategic autonomy is concerned, I think it's a future that has already happened. Why I say that is because I think over the last 5-6 years, we have seen every country, particularly the large countries, but not excluding the smaller ones, talk about US first, China first, Mexico first, country first. And I think this kind of an inward looking, perhaps it's to please the domestic constituencies among democracies, but this kind of an inward looking prioritization of affairs wherein the global is an appendage, global interactions are an appendage, and globalization is a mere tool to fix domestic issues, is now a reality. So there is no, earlier Amrita had mentioned about values. What values are we talking about? India is constantly being condemned by UK, by US, saying that we should not do this, it should not do that. India is not a democracy, etc. But the same people willingly and happily and with great enthusiasm go and embrace Chinese universities, Chinese businesses, Chinese markets. So I see there is this kind of a duality which of course over the next, I see this year is going to be the end of that duality. I think a whole lot of people, and I hope some of you here will be exploring this, will be ending. But to say that it's going to end forever, I don't think so. So once you have every country for itself, every leader for himself or herself, then you cannot have fixed alliances. You will always have alliances that will be moving targets. Quad. Until a year ago, Quad was coming and going, and India was also not certain whether it's actively participating or not, etc. We don't want to embarrass China, we don't want to hurt, etc., etc. These were the conversations. What's happening today? Overnight, post Galwan, India has taken lead in this. Everybody's on board. I believe this will continue. At the same time, India is part of BRICS. India is part of the Shanghai. So I think these will be coming and going, and this, I think what's happened is from a unipolar world to a bipolar world is what China wants. And what the world wants is a multipolar world. And that multipolarity in some ways is coming. And I think that there is a failure of the United Nations, which is accentuating these multipolarities across the world. And that is the future which I say that has already happened.
Yes, I want to come back on that point about the failure of the United Nations and global institutions in general, but I believe Amrita wants to weigh in on what you've just said. So Amrita, go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, I want to pick up on a point that Harsh was making, and that was music to my ears, right? And that is exactly how I think one should be framing the Indian narrative. And so what he talked about was Indian universalism, right? And he's absolutely right there, right? And so, and the point, so I want to make 2 points. One, you talked, Palki, about how, you've got Trudeau, you've got the British Parliament, everybody commenting on India's farmer protests, for example, right? What do they do about China? They go and, Europe goes and signs the comprehensive agreement on investment, right? And there's all that, yeah, we really care about labor standards, environmental standards. China, don't do what you're doing, right? And that's what Europe says. And then it goes and signs the comprehensive agreement on investment, still to be passed by Parliament, but that was already by the European Parliament, but that was already a big step. So there is clearly there is a big difference in which how Europe looks at the Chinese market versus the Indian market, right? And I have a lot of conversations on this where I try and point out to, it's messier to deal with democracies, obviously. But this is also why you should be embracing more trade with India. But trade for a while has ceased to be just about trade, right? Because we are seeing the weaponization of trade. We're seeing the weaponization of interdependence. That's my one point. My second point is the one that Harsh is talking about, because this is something that India hasn't laid claim to, and it's there. Right? I mean, the books have been written, just so many, also by Indian authors, on why does India not have a strategic policy? Why does India not have a view of the global? Why does India not have a foreign policy? It does. It actually does. Because a lot of those texts that we study in relation to the Atman and the Brahman do actually have quite a lot on how you deal with other beings, right? And so, I mean, you talked about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, but there's another very powerful shlok, and that is Atmavat Sarva Bhuteshu Ya Pashyati Sa Panditaha, right? That is a notion, he looks upon himself in the same way as he looks upon all other creatures. He is the truly wise one, right? This is an understanding, a universal understanding of human rights that are not only human. That is incredible. And what could be more universal than that? And we should be claiming it. And Gautam was asking me before we started, what am I working on? This is one of the things I'm working on in terms of Indian universalism.
Right. So the world's approach to us is one thing. Let me turn this around and play the devil's advocate here, Harsh. The problem also stems from how sometimes we in India seek validation from institutions, individuals, and governments in the West. And when we do that, every time the UNHRC sits in judgment over something without, I dare say, a proper and thorough understanding of a subject, every time some global institution or somebody in some government makes a statement about India, we start questioning our own approach to things. Do you think that needs to change, and do you see evidence of that change as well?
I think another excellent question. Absolutely. I think that needs to be modified. I think there are some early signs. I think there was an article in Hindustan Times just last week that the Ministry of External Affairs is thinking of starting through a think tank, starting its own ranking of political and economic freedom in the world and rankings of democracies across the world. So that's another kind of Purva Paksha that we are trying to do, right? I mean, as I think Amrita very beautifully mentioned earlier, that liberalism or democracy as we Indians see or perceive it. So there is no one definition of how do you define anyways, these are very subjective, to be very honest, even if we do it. So I think it needs to change, but I think there's a broader economic disequilibrium at play, which explains it partially. And partially it is our current or definitely erstwhile social elite, which was excessively schooled in a certain Anglophone way. So what I mean by that is, even today, let's say the global GDP is $80 trillion. We are at 3 trillion. So that we are getting to close to around 3.5–4% of the global GDP. That was as low as 1 or 2% about 2–3 decades ago. And compared to our per capita income compared to the US in nominal terms was 1% around the turn of the millennium. So, sometimes, as I say, material conditions lead to ideas and then they reflects back into material conditions further. So one was just our economic weakness, which I do think will be rapidly ameliorated. But there is also a lagging indicator, which was our social elite. For various reasons, we are multilingual, for all kinds of reasons, very, very Anglophone. And we did not have, and we perhaps to still extent do not have the cultural confidence. So for example, the way the Chinese diplomat spoke back to the Secretary of State in the US in Alaska just a couple of days ago. By the way, in his earlier manifestation, he was a translator, English to Mandarin translator, but he spoke in Mandarin only and for 16 minutes instead of 2 minutes. And I think that kind of cultural confidence, we are slowly beginning it. For example, Vajpayee famously spoke in Hindi at the United Nations. Narendra Modi speaks quite decent English, but he often chooses to speak increasingly in Hindi, and a translator translates that. And I think, so one of the reasons, if you read The Economist, is they will say, well, this Anglophone elite is no longer in power in Delhi. And hence, as Jaishankar said, there are more and more people in India who do not seek foreign approval. So that is a painful transition, because that was not how things were so far. So I agree it will change, but once again, the way to do that is to again start counter with our own indices, our own rankings, our own reports. People like ORF need to do that more. We need more channels like Beyond to again do that Purva Paksha. I think that is the only way to do it, because in 1.3, 1.4 billion people, some people will always try to latch on to some foreign report, right? The USCIRF, the report on religious freedom, they will say that in Switzerland, if you have a ban on minarets, that's not necessarily a wrong thing to do. But of course, if you have that in India, that's a very wrong thing to do. So there is a sense of Eurocentrism, perhaps subconscious white supremacy, that it's difficult for them to call out for whatever reason. So we need our own rankings, we need our own reports, and we need this chip off our shoulders now. And I think it's happening, as Gautam is saying, but it's a work in progress.
Right, and you see it in every aspect of the narrative, if I may. For instance, the media in the West, Rajeev, there is a gunman and there is a terrorist. Some decisions are Islamophobic and some are for safeguarding the security of a society. And those decisions and those narratives are turned to suit the interests of a particular lobby or institution or government. I think that's a game that India will have to ace if India is going to be able to beat them. I think China's approach is a little more abrasive. How do you think India can make that shift, make that transition without being offensive?
So my view on this is quite simple, actually. I feel India's values should be reflected in India's conduct. India should sort of not have, or rather not sort of care too much about some other person or some other country preaching that, oh, your values are this, hence you should do that. I think we clear in how we behave, and how we sort of do diplomacy, and how we sort of you were talking about vaccine Maitri. I think that reflects the best of Indian values. So for some other country to suddenly come and say that, wait, your ranking has come down here, and now you are this, and 5 years ago you were that. Well, I think we should not be abrasive like China. We should not be sort of too offensive about it, or play too much offense about it. But as Harsh mentioned, we create our own institutions. We create our own commentaries. We create our own we kind of reverse the gaze, to put it sort of bluntly.
You've also both advocated that India should focus on the rights of the individual rather than the rights of a community. Harsh, do you believe Indian institutions are robust enough to ensure that?
I think Indian institutions are absolutely very robust, especially given the fact that we are only 70 years old as a republic, compared to say 240 years for the US, compared to the fact that we had universal adult franchise. That means every single man, woman of all religions, language, caste, voting as soon as they become adults. For example, many European countries got women voting rights as late as the 1960s. In some counties of Switzerland, Spain was under Franco, the dictator. So we must realize that India becoming rich and having politically stable institutions while being very poor is not only an exception, it's a massive exception on the world stage. So if you adjust for that, I do think Indian institutions are fairly robust. They can be more robust, absolutely. On the first point you mentioned, this is very important. We need, if Indian law and if the Indian state sees citizens officially as belonging to different religions, I think that negates the most beautiful aspects of Indian spirituality, which again, as Amrita mentioned, has this kind of golden rule about it, that, I see you as I would see myself, whether it's Buddha, you can go by a definition of dharma that Rajeev and I quote in our book. So the only way for us to look at as a fellow individual citizen in terms of law has to be, you are an individual citizen, free and equal as I am. But of course, as a society, we should be able to see each other as groups, if that is what we so choose, which is why in our book, we call the opposite of secularism, the proper definition of secularism is not communalism as we call it in India, is theocracy. Because secularism and theocracy are features of the state. Communalism is a feature of society. So it's very important that you do not force a definition of religion upon, say, an Indian Muslim that you cannot adopt, or that you should be okay if your husband has 3 more wives, or that you should only get half an inheritance from your father if you're a woman. Why? They should be all the same and equal. Whether you want to, there is uniform civil code as an example, which is all about individual rights in the US, in UK, and Australia, and nobody says minorities are oppressed because having the same civil laws in all these other democracies. It is only in India that we somehow presume that creating a separate enclave for Sharia, but only in civil rights, not in criminal rights, is somehow not only okay, but the right thing to do. And I call it the soft bigotry of low expectations. One Indian editor said, how can we do something if, quote unquote, they do not say it? And my point is, the moment you start saying we and they, you are the one who's already built mental walls. So either we are one, as in one nation, but individuals, or we are separate groups. And if we are separate groups, why did we accept partition? We accepted partition so that we could then all be individuals, so that we could leave that legacy behind of separate religious identities. So what was the point of taking partition? Are we just trying to kill time before we have another partition a few decades later on? So it's important from strategic, from moral, from spiritual point of view. And it is not a Western value. It is our dharmic value that we see people as individuals, because salvation in dharma is only individual. It's never collective. So it's it's something that Rajeev and I feel very strongly about in our book. If you've read it, you'll definitely notice that. And this is just pure vote bank hypocrisy. There's no other way to even defend it. In other cases, you might still argue that there is a certain point of view. In this case, it has been inertia. And we quote many Indian Muslims who said, for example, Rajeev, what is the name of the Mumbai lawyer who said...
Justice Chagla, MC Chagla.
So MC Chagla said that the only reason why Nehruji did not have individual rights and same laws for all people was because, either he was afraid, or he was just being communal, or he was just being very tactically smart in terms of getting a vote bank. As MC Chagla said, this is wrong for Indian Muslims. Similarly, Badruddin Tyabji's family and many other people, many progressive Muslims actually were felt let down by this view of the Indian state.
Hamid Dalwai.
Yeah. Rajeev, do you want to add to that?
No, yeah. No, I think Harsh has put it very well. I was just mentioning the name of Hamid Dalwai as well. Hamid Alwai and his wife had for many decades actually fought for the Uniform Civil Code.
Right.
Palki, may I just make a small comment on the previous discussion? You know, when you were talking about narratives, just a short comment. Okay. You know, at Observer, we keep getting guests from abroad. They keep coming. Media comes. Think tankers come. In one such meeting, there was this media from Europe. And you can take all the top names of publications and TV channels there, and they were there. They came to discuss CAA. They had come for a different issue, but they want, at that time, the CAA agitation was in full swing. And so they began to ask questions. Why is this? Why is that? Etc. I just asked them, how many of you have read the law? And not a single one. Not a single person had read that law. And they were holding forth on all kinds of issues. My point is, the narratives are set elsewhere. They are swallowed whole without unquestioningly by people who are supposed to be skeptics, people who are supposed to read, people who are supposed to analyze context, etc., etc. They are swallowed whole. I believe we are giving excessive respect just because of the color of a skin or the nationality of the person.
I remember reading your write-up on the farm laws as well, and you said that how it takes years and years for people to come up with ideas of reform, and it takes people who are protesting. Most of them have not even probably read the reform that the government is talking about, and that remains a concern. But we are talking about the rights of the individual, Amrita, and Harsh mentioned vote bank hypocrisy. The fact is that votes are the currency in an electoral democracy, and so religion and caste have been used as what shall I say, handles to go up the ladder and to get more votes. Do you believe as a society there is now a consciousness that people from all sides have been taken for a ride by those who wanted to be in power, and that religion is just an excuse for them to galvanize support? Do you believe that India as a society has matured to the point where they will be more accepting of a reform of this nature?
I will limit my comment on this because I think Harsh and Rajeev are better qualified to speak on this particular angle. But I would say this, that in any democracy, right, as we saw in the US in January, what was happening in the US, there is a constant tug and war that will always take place. And the more real your democracy, the more meaningful your democracy, the more contestation you will have, right? And what we need to be doing is perhaps taking charge of the narrative and showing that this contestation shows how that the Indian democracy is still alive and well and growing, right? That's something because what we are doing all the time is we're very much on the defensive, right? And this is where I would actually probably disagree with Gautam, right? Because for me, this is not about people are of a different color or if they're from a different state. This is about narratives which win or don't, right? All I want to do is I want to have a persuasive winning narrative. And I think that can be done by having a strong component internally, and then forming networks, working with the media, with domestic constituencies, international constituencies. It's something China did very well until its wolf warrior diplomacy arose. We should be happy about the wolf warrior diplomacy because people are waking up to the problems that China is posing, right? Whereas we were always always on the back foot. And I think we need to stop doing that also in terms of the domestic reform process. And the other point that I want to pick up on is, you talked about strategic autonomy and alliances. And this is what I'm saying also to the US, and I'm saying it to the EU, and I'm saying it to many other countries that say that they are interested in democracy. I'm saying, well, at some point, you all have to stop sitting on the fence, right? And so I think the Quad is a great initiative, but Japan has a security guarantee, right? Australia is also reasonably well protected. Who is in the region next to China? India is, right? So I wouldn't mind seeing some more commitment, some real commitment to India from the US, from Australia, from Japan, right? Rather than the nice talk, and yes, the military exercises, which are great, and they're an important signal, but I don't want this to be just cheap, what game theorists call cheap talk, right? I want this to be costly signaling, which shows that there is a commitment to a democracy. That also works in the other direction, where India also commits a little, says it's interested in a partnership with NATO. That's an example. Doesn't mean you become a part of NATO in any way, but you say you're interested in a partnership with NATO, which breaks, I know this breaks like decades of tradition, and also I've written about this in terms of India's worldviews, but it's a conversation we need to start having.
Right. We have a couple of questions coming in from our audience, and we have a few minutes left on this panel. So let me throw the questions and you guys can tell me which ones you want to take. One says, through changing political dynamics, how can India ensure it stays on track towards fixed future goals? Harsh, do you want to take this?
Well, absolutely. I think the most important fixed future goal has to be economic growth. And I think the most important thing to do is just keep on reforming, which is what the government has been willing to do, especially in its second term. And you'll get all kinds of domestic and increasingly, as you're seeing, foreign pushback. You just have to remain at it. And the only answer to that is winning at the hustles, the electoral hustles, state elections, which are coming up, local elections, national elections, by polls. They are the tests that matter for your legitimacy. And if you're passing those tests and your reforms, that's good enough. Everything else is secondary.
Gautam, political dynamics change. What does that do to your vision and your reform agenda?
I don't know. I'm a little disappointed with the Congress at this moment, not because of any political reason, but simply because they are not even following their own manifesto. Look at the farm laws. It is very much there in their own manifesto that what they were supposed to do has been done by the 3 farm laws. And now they are backing out. Earlier, it is the Congress which has given us the 1991 reforms. It is the Congress that has repeatedly talked about set up various commissions here and there and brought the positive change in our country. And now suddenly, because of a political reason, you are taking a U-turn. This is not acceptable. Nonetheless, they are isolating themselves. I think a new politics is emerging. For now, it seems as though the BJP is sort of unstoppable, but that's never the case. Things do change. The idea again is, I think India wants change. The Indian people wants change. The Rajasic notion of our country wants change. The change will come. It is destined. It's just a matter of who the instrument choose at the center and at the state is. But change is here. You can't fight this change.
Right. Rajeev, maybe you want to take this one. How can one equally participate in creating a narrative for India when most of our intelligentsia is not in tune with the ground realities?
Well, nowadays with online media, digital media, and so on, it's very easy to contribute if you want to contribute. In fact, one could argue that digital media platforms have actually disintermediated conventional media to a large extent, and getting out sort of your opinions, getting out even contrary opinions has never been easier. So whereas earlier,
I'm flattered you think that the intelligentsia is the media.
No, but they do constitute a part of the media, right? Media is the distribution mechanism for an intelligentsia's ideas. So whether it's books, whether it is sort of newspaper articles, magazine articles, nowadays, you can go direct to consumers. So I see that as an enormously positive change actually in the last 15 years.
This also plays into your statement, Amrita, of a battle of narratives. So for your narrative to win, your own people, so to speak, should be in tune with what you're trying to tell the world. And that's not the case, especially in a democracy. Someone here said there's too much democracy in India and got into a lot of trouble. But that is a fact, that there are always ideas that counter what you're trying to say, what you're trying to pitch. How do you balance the two and make sure that the story of India that you want to project to the world remains the story that you want to tell?
I think I think the messiness of democracy is something to value and cherish, needs to be a part of the narrative, right? And the other thing I would say is really important, and Europe is not getting this right at all right now. I'm really worried about the situation here, which is somehow, people sort of in so-called liberal, multilateralist oriented circles, speaking for your nation is somehow supposed to be a bad thing, and it's not. Especially if you're a democracy, for heaven's sake, you were elected to put your nation first. If your people are dying, right, don't let them die, right? Get them the vaccine. And this is where India is such a supermodel of the vaccine Maitri, right? Because India is vaccinating at a very rapid pace, and it is offering vaccines to other countries as well. So there is a very important domestic constituency that all democracies need to be paying attention to, because you can't just go off on your crazy intellectual trip somewhere, right? It won't fly anywhere, right? And then there is also an international audience that needs attention, right? And what we need to do if we want to build a convincing narrative is to get that international attention on our own terms. So along the lines of what Harsh was talking about, so when he was talking about the Indian universalism, for example, right? And also laying claim to the successes, right? The developments, the very positive developments that have already taken place in improving the Indian economy is a powerful example.
Right, I think, okay, we have 2 more minutes to go. And we have 4 panelists. If you could, in 30 seconds, each one of you, give me a gist of what is your vision of India.
Okay, I'll go first, Palki.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
I think the most important thing right now is to focus on economic growth, because we are still very, very poor compared to the rest of the world in per capita terms. And since we, as the upper middle class or elite who like to call ourselves a middle class, even though we are not the middle class, we do not realize how bad off the average median Indian is still living, even though it's improving. And I think once we improve that, just multiplied by the numbers, will automatically increase the weightage of our opinions on the global fora. So a lot of what we are talking about is basically a derivative of economic growth in the coming years. So whatever that requires in terms of reforms, in terms of political management, in terms of macroeconomic out of the box thinking, we need to make sure that we get that right. Thank you.
Rajeev?
No, yeah, I echo Harsh's thoughts. I think building a prosperous, rich India is the main focus for the next probably 25 odd years. I think if we can shift from a per capita income, shift like 5 to 6x at least, if not a 10x, in the next 15-20 years, I think that should be the goal for the country, because that will not just sort of internally make us prosperous, but increase our sort of influence abroad. It will make us more secure as a country. It'll have all kinds of other benefits, that we all are aspiring towards.
Amrita.
I'm going to add 2 more variables to that. To what Harsh and Rajeev said, rich and prosperous, absolutely. We also need a more secure India, and we need an India that is true to its own values, domestically and internationally.
That was precise. Gautam.
I think all 3 speakers have taken the wind off my sails. So I'm going to just be very short and crisp. First, per capita income of $20,000 by the middle of this century. Second, on the high table of setting the new world order. If the United Nations is imploding, let it implode, let it drown. The new order is here. It has begun with G20. It should coagulate more. And I think India will be among those who will define this new world order. Third and final, the India narrative to be unleashed with greater conviction and with strong values, the Indian values of the sort that Amrita and Harsh spoke about.
I'll paraphrase all of you. I think this was a very enriching discussion. This, according to this panel, is a vision of India for the future. We need to work on our economy. We need to work on our security, ensure that, be true to our values and push the India narrative according to Indian values, and be an active player in shaping the new world order. If we manage to do all of this, we should be in a good place. Thank you very much, Amrita, Harsh, Rajeev, and Gautam. It was a pleasure talking to all of you.
Thank you.